I want to talk about understanding wokeness over against the biblical worldview. And I want to give you a very simple diagram for placing or understanding this. That we live in oddball times really needs no explanation. Yes, we know all about it. But why do we live in such oddball times? That has to be explained over and over again. Why do people who are apparently intelligent, grown up, do things that we would consider bizarre? And why do we do things that they consider bizarre? So we have to begin with the biblical doctrine of the antithesis. The biblical doctrine of the antithesis. When our first parents, Adam and Eve, sinned in the Garden of Eden, one of the central consequences of it, and this was all part of God's redemptive purpose and plan, was that He, God, placed a permanent antithesis, that's our word, He placed a permanent enmity or antipathy between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. We see that in Genesis 3:15, where it says, "And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel." And this is a promise that is given actually to us by means of a sentence on the serpent. So the serpent who had deceived Eve and led our parents astray is told that there's going to be a seed of the woman, and he is going to crush your head. He's going to crush your head, and he is going to be wounded in the heel as a result. All right, this is the third chapter of the Bible, and it is the first messianic promise. It's the first promise that God gave us about a coming Christ, about a coming Messiah. Now, this statement of the antithesis explains all of human history. This is why the history of the world is filled with conflict. God comes down in Genesis chapter 3, and he says there's going to be conflict. There's going to be conflict between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. So this is why the world's filled with conflict. This is the central conflict. It is the driver of everything that happens. It is the reason for the long war against God. This is why Jesus had to die, and it's why the death of Jesus resulted in the crushing of the serpent's head and the bruising of the Lord's heel. All right, so that is how it was fulfilled. Christ came, died on the cross, and now here's the problem. Suppose you don't believe this. Suppose you're not a Christian. You don't accept any of this. You don't believe in Adam and Eve. You don't believe in the Garden of Eden. You believe in Darwin and evolution and all that. What if you don't believe the Word of God? Well, if you don't believe this first promise in Genesis 3:15, or in its great fruition, the death and resurrection of Jesus, or in its final culmination, when God finally crushes Satan beneath Christ's feet by crushing Satan beneath the church's feet. In Romans 16:20, Paul says to the Roman church, "The God of peace will soon crush Satan beneath your feet." So this is clearly riffing off of that promise in Genesis 3. So Christ destroyed the devil by dying on the cross, but then there will be subsequent victories over the devil by means of the church triumphing in various ways. But what if you don't believe any of that? So what if you still live in a world in which there is this antithesis? You don't believe in God's antithesis, but you're living in a world that is shaped by this fundamental conflict. You still have to give an account of all of this conflict. You still have to give an account of it. You still have to explain why these wars and battles and arguments and quarrels are still going on out in the world. And the response of the unbeliever boils down to two basic options. All right, so if you're a believer, you accept what God says in Genesis 3 and say, yes, there's an antithesis between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, those who believe in God, those who trust Him through the gospel, and those who don't. But if you reject all that, you've got two basic options as you're dealing with this antithesis. First, you can deny the antithesis. You can just say, I don't believe in it. Or you can misplace the antithesis. You can deny the antithesis, or you can put the antithesis in the wrong place. Okay? You can pretend it isn't there, or you can say, yeah, it's there, but it's not between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. It's between white people and black people, or it's between my nation and all the other nations, or it's between the communists and the anti-communists. So you can deny the antithesis, pretend it's not there, or you can misplace the antithesis. And this is building up to our definition of what it is to be woke. Okay? Denial, but I have to give you a summary of both positions. Denial of the antithesis says that mankind is basically good. Okay, the Christian, the biblical antithesis says that there are believers, all men are sinners, all men are fallen, but some men in their fallenness have trusted in God, have trusted in Christ, the seed of the woman, and others have continued on in their rebellion. They're refusing to trust in God, and so they are rebels, right? They continue on in the rebellion. Denial of the antithesis says that mankind is basically good. All we need is a basic education for everyone, not to mention decent health care and affordable housing. And this is going to remove certain environmental obstacles to the global group hug and make the general consensus obvious. It's going to come, the sun's going to come out, and it's going to become obvious that we're all basically good people and we all want to get along. Not only so, but when we make when we make the harmonious center come into its own, we can then turn our abundant resources to a compassionate treatment of the mental health issues that may be afflicting any remaining dissenters. So what happens if the denial of the antithesis people, the people who come in and say, we're all human beings, we all are saying the same thing, we're all saying the same thing. And then somebody over here says, no, we're not. What are we going to do with that guy? We're all in agreement. No, we're not. What do you do with that heckler? Well, he's obviously mentally disturbed. He obviously needs to get on his meds. He obviously needs to be put in a wagon and taken away and given the treatment, because we all agree. No. They pull him out the door. Okay, so this is why dissent, for example, in the Soviet Union, dissent, disagreeing with the regime, was considered a psychiatric problem. All right? You're not really human. You're not really with the program, because it's an article of faith that we're all saying the same thing. So that's denial of the antithesis. Misplacing the antithesis is what the woke do. All right? Wokeness misplaces the antithesis. Misplacing the antithesis accepts the fact that human history is defined by and driven by a fundamental divide, separating the saints from the non-elect. But then it assigns those categories to arbitrary groupings that are not biblically grounded at all. It starts with obvious divisions like our nation, their nations, or our ethnic group, their ethnic group, or our economic working class, rich pigs, etc. Communists, race baiters, fascists are all guilty of misplacing the antithesis. They have an us-them mentality, just like Christians do. Christians divide the world, those who are saved and those who are lost, those who believe in Christ and those who don't. We have an antithesis. Those who misplace the antithesis just change the uniforms. They just change the labels. And so they say Americans, un-American, American, un-American, or they'll say white, black, or black, white. They pick some other set of categories and say that's the thing that is driving all of human history. Jews, Gentiles. Okay, that's misplacing the antithesis. Now, the woke frenzy that we're dealing with now is the result of leftists of every stripe misplacing the antithesis. They divide human history, they divide the human race into two categories, just like the Christians do, but we draw the line like vertically between those saints and unbelievers, those who are saved and those who are lost. They draw the line horizontally through human society. And they all do it. They all do it, from Marx to the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School were a school of thinkers in Frankfurt, Germany, who at the time of the Second World War fled to America and got teaching jobs in Columbia and Berkeley and different places. And the Frankfurt School, they were the conduit for introducing a lot of this thinking into American society. So Karl Marx, and let me just step aside for a minute. There were two leftists, communists, socialists, collectivists of all stripe, had two different tactical approaches. Marx and Lenin and those who took over the Soviet Union, Chairman Mao took over, who ruled in China, they had sort of a military power. We seize power and we apply the truths of our communist utopia by force, okay? That was the Leninist approach, revolutionary approach. There was another guy, an Italian communist named Gramsci. And Gramsci spent a lot of time in prison, and he argued for what was called this is not his phrase, but it summarizes it, the long march through the institutions. Rather than seizing military control, like the communists in the Soviet Union or in China did, Gramsci argued for a corrosive march through entertainment, the academy, different kinds of schools, churches, denominations, and so forth. That's the long march through the institutions. That's what's happened in our country as leftists have progressively conquered publishing houses, magazines, major media, all the major universities, and so forth. That's the Gramscian approach. But all kinds of communists divide the world into two fundamental categories. And here is the woke antithesis. So we've got the biblical antithesis, and then the woke antithesis is between oppressors and the oppressed. Oppressors and the oppressed. That's the grid that they use to view every social problem. Oppressor class and oppressed class. Oppressors and oppressed. There are, according to their metric, you've got the bad guys and who are running the show, and the poor, downtrodden good guys. And they draw this horizontal line everywhere. They draw this, you can't keep them from drawing it. They draw this kind of horizontal line everywhere, such that there are many different kinds of oppressors. So they can walk into any situation and they'll draw a line this way, and there is an oppressor class and an oppressed class in that setting. So here are some oppressors, according to their metric. Oppressors would be, whites, males, heterosexuals, rich people. Okay, so if you got a lot of, and then you might, in an extraordinary stroke of bad luck, you might be white and male and heterosexual and rich. You are the king of the bad guys now, because you fit into the oppressor class for a bunch of different classes. And then you flip that around. When there are many different kinds of oppressed people, like people of color who aren't conservative, right? So Clarence Thomas doesn't count. He's a conservative Supreme Court justice. He's a person of color, but he doesn't count because he's conservative. So people of color who aren't conservative, or lesbians, or women, and so on. One time I was walking, it was in San Diego, actually. I forget where I was going or why I was there, but I was walking in downtown San Diego, and I walked past a storefront, used to be a storefront, wasn't a store now, but on the window or on the sign, it said, Center for the Empowerment of Deaf Alcoholics. And I thought, How are they keeping this thing afloat? Right? Center for the Empowerment of Deaf Alcoholics. Well, alcoholics are an oppressed class. Deaf people are an oppressed class. And when you see things like that, you can almost be certain that there's government money involved. Somebody's paying somebody to find and recruit people who will fill in those slots. So when you occupy more than one of these oppressed categories, this is what the word intersectionality means. You will sometimes hear the phrase, well, this is an intersectional issue, or it's a matter of intersectionality. That is a woke term. So someone who's intersectionally oppressed is someone who's a woman, who is black, who is a lesbian, she fits in a number of different categories. So her oppression levels go way up because she's being oppressed in all kinds of different ways. Okay, so Christians acknowledge the reality of sin, and we know that even with the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, we don't maintain that the seed of the woman, the professing Christians, have always and everywhere done the right thing, or we're not maintaining that Christians have never wronged anybody. But we're saying there's a basic allegiance to God and his world, and we want to live in a right side up world. We want to live in a world where God made the world, where we are creatures who answer to him, where men are men and women are women, and nobody's trying to blur the difference between them and so on. Now, so malice and enmity and sin can occur in a traditional world and have in a traditional world. But in this new world, in this new woke world, what's happening is the violence and the enmity is just spiraling out of control. So, for many people, what has been surprising is the downward spiral into identity politics. And woke politics is just another way of saying identity politics. You'll have people say, well, I identify as, and what they're doing is they're identifying the tribe that they are part of, and invariably they're wanting to identify with that in such a way as to become a victim. Why do people in the modern world want to be victims? Well, because in the woke setup, the oppressed are the good guys. The victims are the good guys. The people who victimize, by definition, are the bad guys. So it's simply, and this is why, incidentally, in the older Christian approach to justice, let's say a crime was committed, a store was burglarized, or someone was shot or mugged or whatever, and we don't know who did it. Okay? In the old system, we would say we need to investigate, we need to find out who did it, and we need to have a trial and find out all the details and see if this person was responsible in fair trial, and then convict him if the evidence points that way. But today you can have a situation happen, some like George Floyd's death, or if a cop shoots a black man, right? If there's a shooting, cops are oppressor class, and it doesn't matter if the cop is black or Asian or white. But if the cop shoots a black man, then everybody's yelling about it on television before we have any idea of what actually happened. Why? Well, because the thing that determines guilt or innocence in this new system is what class you belong to. It's what, are you a member of the oppressor class? So if I'm talking to someone who is, and this is going to sound, because you live in a Christian world, because you're growing up in a Christian family, and because you're attending a Christian school, this is going to sound bizarre to you, but this is the way it goes. Suppose something happens, and instead of investigating, they simply scapegoat somebody. All right, they just grab the nearest white guy and hustle him off for execution or imprisonment, and you're saying, wait, we don't know if he did it. We don't know if he did it. That's because you're thinking in terms of individual justice, like a Christian. But what they're doing is they're saying, we already know he's an oppressor. We already know what tribe he belongs to. We already know he's guilty. Because that's the fundamental guilt for that. It's not the individual situation, it's what class you belong to. Okay? So, identity politics, when people are identifying with various tribes or different subclasses, that identification is an approach, basically it's an adoption of woke politics. But it's very fragile. And the reason it's fragile is because all these different groups keep changing. Everything's in flux. Everything is moving around all the time. So we now have people hoisting weird flags in an effort to rally people to a new particular cause. And when we get close, we find that the rallying point is for genderqueer deaf alcoholics with a penchant for cis boys. So sing out, be proud. Genders multiply. I think there's something like 57 genders now. Identities grow like mushrooms. And the ultimate end of that process, at the ultimate end of that process, the misplaced antithesis is between the atomistic, not atomistic, but atomistic ego and every form of objective reality. The biblical name for this is the outer darkness. Okay, that's what's happening. The people who are living this way are headed toward the abyss. They're headed toward the outer darkness. Now, I'm going to say something that, again, because you are in a Christian setting and you're being educated in a Christian setting, you're going to feel like I'm telling you the grass is green and the sun rises east. But and you say, and who denies that? Well, lots of people. There are two approaches to truth. Two approaches to truth. One of them is called the correspondence view of truth. The correspondence view of truth says, if I put the microphone on the lectern, and then I step back and say, the microphone is on the lectern, that statement I just made is true if the statement correspondence view, if that statement corresponds to an actual state of affairs in the world where there's a microphone on the lectern. Okay? And you go over and look and there's a microphone on the lectern, and I just said there's a microphone on the lectern. If those two things match, if those two things line up, then the statement is true. That is the Christian understanding of truth. When we say Jesus rose from the dead, that statement is true if you run out to the tomb and the tomb is empty, and it's empty because Jesus rose. That's the correspondence view of truth. That's the biblical view of truth. The rival to this is called the coherence view of truth. The coherence view of truth simply has to have the story be internally consistent. Okay, so now I took the microphone off the lectern and I say something like, the microphone is on the lectern. And you say, no, it's not, you took it off. I say, the microphone is on the lectern. You say, and look, I say, look, I feel deeply. This is my feeling, and you're not going to challenge my feelings, are you? I feel like the microphone is on the lectern. Let me put it another way. The microphone being on the lectern is my truth. Have you ever heard that phrase, my truth? That's what they're doing. So when someone says, it's my truth that so-and-so called me names, or it's my truth that I was insulted or mugged or oppressed by that person over there, that's my truth. And I ran across this decades ago in a counseling situation where someone was alleging that she had been molested by her father many years before. And I was talking with a man who was counseling her and with this woman's brother who had grown up in the same home. And so this came up, she was alleging that he had molested her. And her brother said, that is not the home. That's not, no, it didn't happen. No, right? No. And the counselor didn't say, well, they obviously hid it from you because, yes, it did happen. The counselor didn't say that. The counselor said, the fact that this happened is her truth. In other words, it didn't matter if it happened or not. It just didn't matter. What mattered was whether you felt like it had. Now, that's the coherence view of truth. That's the coherence. It's just got to be internally consistent. Now, these two views of truth cannot be reconciled. They cannot be reconciled. So, if as soon as you say, my view of truth is that's my story and I'm sticking to it, you're going to say, as you head off to the outer darkness, I think that this is the path to heaven. That's my story. That's my truth. So, it is possible to deny the antithesis, but only for a brief time and only under certain select conditions. This is the first option of denying the antithesis. In a culture that's largely homogenous, the way America was shortly after the Second World War, when the liberal consensus reigned supreme and it was possible to say that everyone agrees on certain core principles, we're all saying the same thing, really. There were marginal voices back then, far away from the microphones, who would say hurtful things like, no, we aren't saying the same thing at all. But when a particular culture's center is still cohesive enough to hold, where most people are saying that, such marginal voices can be dismissed and ignored. Everyone who matters can still act as though we all agree on the essentials. We don't need to account for the crackpots. So denial of the antithesis is the stance of the liberal at peace. Denial of the antithesis is the liberal at peace. But in such periods of peace, when there's a large consensus, that kind of state of affairs is rare. It doesn't happen a lot. What happens when that consensus starts to break down, as it has in our day? That consensus breaks down, as it has in our day. When I was a kid, there were 3 television networks, 3 channels, and 1 local channel. So basically 3 national channels, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and there was 1 local channel usually. And so when you went to watch television, you had 4 choices. Okay, 4 choices. And whatever was on, and that's what you watched if you wanted to watch something. In other words, they had one way of feeding you what they wanted you to hear. Now, there's 158 channels. Right? You get one of these new fancy, you have so many voices yelling at you from all directions. You can curate your own network, a news network. You can curate anything you want, and you've got this consensus. The liberal consensus has broken down, and now we're entering into an era of tribalism, which is this tribalism is the woke tribalism. So you're identifying with various tribes all at the same time. So this leads to the liberal at war, which is where the progressives spiral down into identity politics, into woke politics, and so on. So very quickly, I want to answer 5 basic questions and then open it up for questions for you. What is the biblical antithesis? The biblical antithesis is between those who are the elect of God, those who are trusting him, those who believe his word, and those who reject it. Seed of the woman, seed of the serpent. So this is why Jesus called the Pharisees, for example, a brood of vipers. He's not just calling random names. The brood of vipers means he's identifying them as the seed of the serpent. So the biblical antithesis goes back to Genesis 3:15, the division between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. What is the woke antithesis? The woke antithesis is a misplaced antithesis, and it divides the world between oppressors and oppressed. And there are all kinds of different oppressors, and there are all kinds of different oppressed, and you really lucked out if you have 3 or more oppressed classes that you belong to. That's the woke antithesis. Why is the woke antithesis inherently unstable? It's inherently unstable because it's based on men and their opinions and their identifications and all the things, now we're at the point where anything somebody can think up they can go do and say, I feel like that's what I am. And presto, you've got a new category invented. I feel like you've heard about kids who are furries. They go to their school dressed up like an animal, and the school provides them with a litter box. And are people really doing that? Yes, they are. Here's the good news. In the long run, stupidity doesn't work. It's not tenable. It's not sustainable. Why is compromise between a biblical worldview and a woke worldview an impossibility? The reason it's impossible to blend these two worldviews is because at the beginning of the world, God established the antithesis. In other words, God promised that these two views are always going to be at war. That's God's promise. You can't harmonize them, you can't reconcile them, you can't blend them. And what are some of the basic reasons why Christians who see this don't speak out? Well, the first reason they don't speak out is they don't see it. They're not instructed. They just feel like everything's weird. I don't know why. Something's wrong with this, but I don't know what it is. But often Christians do see what's wrong with it. They do see the problem, and they're afraid to get in trouble. The issue is one of absence of courage. So, are there any questions? I'd be happy to call on. If you got your hand up and I'm not seeing you because I'm old, yell. Yes.
How is woke tribalism different than the covenantal group that we are as Christians?
Okay, let me repeat the question, make sure I've got it. How is woke tribalism different from the fact that God has placed us in different families and actual tribes and actual groupings? Is that the question? Okay, that's a fantastic question, because the Christian, the dividing between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, it's not that we deny the existence of like male and female. It's not like we deny the existence of different ethnic groupings. Like, so someone can belong to an Aboriginal tribe in Australia and someone else is a suburban housewife in Cleveland, right? They belong to different tribes. And getting a good grasp of these things doesn't mean that they have to pretend that they're not who they are, right? The great church father Augustine said that living a virtuous life was a matter of structuring rightly ordered loves. Okay, rightly ordered loves. So what the Christian does is he ranks his different allegiances in a hierarchy. So I am a white American male, and I have a loyalty to my country. I'm an American. I'm happy to be an American. But let's say I meet a Chinese brother, and it might be necessary under certain circumstances for me to hide that Chinese brother from his government or possibly from my government. If let's say we're both Bible smugglers, we might be hiding what we're doing from both governments, right? Because my allegiance to America, it does not come to the level of my allegiance to Christ. So what I'm saying about the antithesis, seed of the woman, seed of the serpent, is the ultimate loyalty. Subordinate loyalties are absolutely fine so long as they are subordinate. Okay? So I'm very grateful to subordinate loyalty is being an American. I'm very grateful to be an American. But because I'm grateful to my country and my nation, I understand fully why a South Korean would be grateful for his nation, for his people. So you don't see, you don't expect to see two men in the aisle at Safeway at the greeting card section getting into a fist fight because one of them tried to buy a card to the world's greatest mom, and the other guy saw it and said, "No, you don't have the world's greatest mom. I have the world's greatest." Now, if you honor your mother, you understand another man honoring his mother. So you cannot teach. You are receiving an education in the Western classical tradition. You're receiving Well, you're receiving a classical Christian education. And what that means is, as I've told people often, you can't teach young people to, you can't teach people to honor other cultures by teaching them to despise their own. Okay, so you have to cultivate an affection for your subordinate loyalties, but you have to do so as a Christian, always keeping them subordinate, knowing that there's a time when, like Rahab in Jericho, she hides the spies because loyalty to God required it. Okay, does that answer your question? Yes?
So we're taught to be culture shapers here at Logos, so how in a practical way should we kind of dive into the whole land of wilderness without getting in over our heads and just like, not having enough resources? It's like comes back to people who are like younger and maybe shouldn't be chatting with people online about, things that are over their heads.
Yeah. So how do we engage with the woke culture without getting in over your heads? Okay. So one of the things you should recognize is very little of this is going to be accomplished by debating with trolls online. It's not going to get you very far at all. One of the things that is happening, and I see it happening all the time, is when Christians live together in community and love each other in community, and the kids are honoring the parents, and the parents are taking care to instruct and care for their kids, and the relationships are flourishing, that kind of community is powerfully attractive, especially to people who are unloved and neglected, and they think they're out there in a dog-eat-dog world. And one of the best things we can do is to create a living, vibrant, genuine community where you're loving your neighbor. One of my favorite humorists was a guy named P.J. O'Rourke, and I love to quote him on this. He said, "Everybody wants to save the world, but nobody wants to help mom with the dishes." And the actual thing that we can do is to make a difference where you are, to do the thing right in front of you. What is the duty you have right in front of you? Well, it's to love your classmates. It's to do honest work. It's to study hard. What is your assigned duty? And as you fulfill your assigned duty, you don't go charging off to fix the world. What you're doing is you're fixing it right where you are. And then you let God direct you at the appropriate time. And you'll see that in the parable of the Samaritan. Who's my neighbor? Well, Jesus answers that with, your neighbor is the one who's right in front of you, whoever's in front of you right now. So a time will come, if you're giving yourself to fulfilling your responsibilities and duties in the community where you are, then you're going to find, to your surprise, you're in a conversation with someone at a coffee shop that you weren't looking for, but God just gave to you. All right. Thank you so much.